How we doing? Everybody awake? Ooh, you guys went downhill real quick on that one. Hey, my name's John. Excited to be here today. Apparently, I'm way more nervous about this message than I have been in previous messages, because I didn't really realize this, but Katie last night was like, "Are you stressed? You seem stressed." And I'm like, "I didn't think I was stressed, but now that you asked me, I guess I'm stressed now." So a little bit of a conversation there. But then all of a sudden at midnight, I woke up in like a cold sweat because I had this dream that Sunday morning had already happened, and right when the worship team left and Jake prayed, and they said, and the lights came on, I wasn't here. And I don't know where I was, but all I know is right after service, they were like, "Where were you?" Because I don't know who did it, like who spoke, but somebody ran up and did the message. And then it happened again the second service. So here I had this message and I didn't speak at all, and then everybody was mad at me. And then I woke up like at midnight in this cold sweat, and I'm like, "Oh, it hasn't happened yet." So I made sure that I got here early to make sure I didn't miss my cue. And I'm here, and now you're stuck with me. And apparently I'm really nervous, but then I was worried because am I going to come up here? We're talking about forgiveness, which I love this series. I love that we're spending weeks on this series and not just 1 week, right? Because it's easy to be like, "Hey, we're all really good at forgiving." Am I right? And then all of a sudden, 3 minutes later, we're like, "Oh wait, maybe not." And so I'm glad we're spending weeks on this, but even then I was like, am I going to get up here? And then as I sit up here, I'm going to think of all the people that I need to ask for forgiveness for, including you. No, I'm just kidding. No. So then I was super stressed of okay, God, is there a lot of unforgiveness in me? So I'm going to see what we're doing. But we made it through first service and I didn't cry or anything that much. And we're going to have some fun. So, hey, we're in a series on forgiveness. I am loving it because I think it's something that we do need to unpack for a little while, because I don't know about you, but I'm not a professional forgiver. And you might be. But I think as life happens, there's things that just grab us, and it's hard to find that time to say, wait a minute, I think I do need to forgive here, or I do need to ask for forgiveness. And so I love that we're spending a little bit of time. Today, what I would love to do is deal with a misconception about forgiveness, because I think for a long time, there's these two words that have been put together, and I don't think they should go together. And it usually is said like this: you should forgive and forget. And there was a book published about it 40 years ago by a Christian author who was I think he wrote kind of the textbook that for a long time, that's the idea that came, is you should always forgive and then forget. And I don't necessarily think those two exist on the same atmospheric level. I think forgiveness is totally different than forgetfulness. I think we forget out of convenience, right? But if you're like me, sometimes somebody makes you really mad, and then you get over it because you've forgotten about it. And then shocker, a little bit later, that exact same person makes you mad for the exact same thing. That doesn't mean we're forgiving them, right? We just happen to forget because we live very, very busy lives typically. But I don't think they interact on the same level. I think forgiveness is an amazing thing to practice. I think forgetfulness is something that we just wish for when we want things to be convenient. And I don't think it's how God works. I don't think it's in his nature to forget. I don't think, number one, we would want him to ever forget things, number one. But even he tells us this. And so there's this chapter in Hebrews. It's this book later on in the New Testament. And if you ever want a quick read on what our relationship with God looks like now that Jesus has done what he's done, Hebrews 10 is an amazing chapter just to read through. And about halfway down in that chapter, this is a quote from the Old Testament, but it says this: "Their sins and lawless acts I will remember no more." And this is God talking here. And did you notice the word that he uses? I will remember no more. He doesn't say he forgot them. He says, I will remember them no more, which says this. Basically, he's saying, I will not bring them back against you. Because God doesn't forget. He's just choosing not to grab it again and say, hey, we got to deal with this one more time. That's what he's doing. And I think that's the example for us. It's not forgive and forget. It's forgive because we're making a choice to forgive. I think too many times forgiveness, we kind of wait for it to be the feeling, right? Can I feel like I forgive them? But I think we've got to change that to start looking at it. Forgiveness is a choice. Maybe even more so, forgiveness is kind of a practice that we put into place. And a lot of times the feelings will follow. but it's something we have to take a step in. And I think this is the way God's related with us for a long time, to be honest, or specifically Israel. Now, if you know me at all, you know I can spend a whole long time nerding out on Jewish history. And your laughs are because I do this every time I speak. And here's the reason, is because Christianity comes out of Judaism. So like there is so much for us to learn because like Judaism was long before Christianity was. And that's our history, that's our heritage. So the more that we can learn from that, I think we get to understand who God is and then what Jesus accomplished. So what I love is in just a few weeks, there's a Jewish holiday coming. Probably the most holy Jewish holiday that's on their calendar. And it's this term. They call it this, Yom Kippur. Yom means day, Kippur means atonement. So you might have heard this before, the Day of Atonement. Now, today, you'll find synagogues will be packed, there'll be fasting, and it's a day to remember God's mercy. That's how it's practiced today. It's a beautiful day. But back when the temple was there and the sacrificial system, this is the day that you might have heard these stories where they had the two goats and one goat got sent into the wilderness as like the scapegoat. The other goat got sacrificed. And then the whole community would come and watch the high priest perform tradition after tradition. And he would have to do it the right way because he was about to take 1 foot into the Holy of Holies one time of year where God dwelt. And he was going to basically ask for appeasement for the whole nation of Israel. And that's what would happen year after year. It was this holy day when the high priest got to go in and meet with God for those few minutes that he was in there. 10 days before Yom Kippur was another holiday, and it's called Rosh Hashanah. It's coming up, and actually what I love about this series right now, and I don't know if Jeremy planned this, but right now, we're coming up on these two holidays. They're actually going to happen in like 2 weeks. But what would happen is Rosh Hashanah is Jewish New Year. And Jewish New Year would be celebrated just like we celebrate our New Year. You look ahead to all the new things that are coming. You get really excited about the new year, like all these new kind of feeling, like the new mercy, this new time, this new season that's coming. That happens on Rosh Hashanah, which this year will be September 14th and 15th. Then there's 10 days until Yom Kippur. And in view of Yom Kippur coming, this Day of Atonement, what the Jewish tradition would be is spending those 10 days making sure that you've made amends in all your relationships. So the community would start reviewing their lives. And are there amends I need to make? Are there people that I need to ask for forgiveness? Or are there people that I need to forgive? Because, and this was the idea, I cannot get to Yom Kippur having not forgiven those around me. And those 10 days are coming up, and I think it's so appropriate for us to spend some time talking about forgiveness, because I think it's something that we need to talk about. We need to look at not as something that just happens naturally, but something that we actually step into. So when Peter asks this question, I'm going to dive into Matthew 18 today, but when Peter asks this question, a lot of people think that it could be during this season between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur that Peter looks at Jesus and says, hey, Jesus, how many times should I forgive my brother and sister? And Jeremy's mentioned this last week, and you've heard like what Peter's doing is he offers an answer. We're going to put it on the screen right here in just a second. But Peter offers an answer. He says up to 7 times, kind of doubling and adding to what the rabbis would normally say at the time. And then Jesus answers this way, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. And people think that this conversation happened right about this time of year, when we're heading into this season in Jewish tradition, when they would be forgiving each other and making amends. Because have you noticed that when you enter traditions, you start asking why you do them? Any parents, we just started school. Has anybody else had their student or their kid ask, why do I have to go to school? Right? It's kind of natural to the season, right? And so why do I have to take calculus? Why do I have to? Well, just do it, right? And so, but we're facing Yom Kippur, we're facing all this, and Peter asked this question, how many times should I forgive my brother or sister? Should I do it up to 7 times? And Jesus replies and adds to it, how about up to 77 times? Now, I'm going to give you a little bit more here. I know that, and you're excited about learning Bible trivia stuff. There's a cool thing that happens here and how Jesus answers this, and it goes all the way back to Genesis. So Genesis 1 and 2, we know God created everything, and that's the story. Genesis 3 is when everything breaks down and sin enters. Genesis 4 is when we hear about the first murder. Cain marries his brother Abel, right? Well, later on in the chapter, we hear about these descendants of Cain. And there's this guy named Lamech, and Lamech confesses to another murder. And this is how he says it. Cain was avenged 7 times. Lamech will be avenged 77 times. And what's interesting here is I wonder if the gospel writer here is bringing restoration, because that's what Jesus does, right? Jesus restores that which was broken. And I wonder if the story that takes place back in Genesis 4, if Matthew, as he writes this, he starts saying, I need you to know that Jesus is bringing restoration in ways that you never thought possible. And that's what's taking place in this. And so what happens is Jesus actually answers this way. I tell you not 7 times, but 77 times. And then he answers by telling a story. And this is a story that you'll probably know this word when I say it. It's called a parable. Is that familiar? Give me a nod if that's pretty common. Okay, so parables are an amazing thing. And we're going to talk about this parable. I'm actually going to dive into the parable a little bit today. This is actually Jesus' longest lesson on forgiveness in Scripture. So this is Jesus unpacking forgiveness in the way that he does. He tells the story. So I'm going to start by talking about it today. Jeremy's actually going to dig into it again next week because there's so much in this parable. But before I read it to you, I want to make sure that we're ready to hear a parable. Because, let me say it, can I say it this way? Jesus told a lot of parables. And I don't know, since you and I mostly aren't Jewish, there might be some here, but most of us aren't Jewish, we haven't been taught how to hear parables. So typically when you and I read parables, they become bedtime stories, not Jewish parables. And when Jews told a parable, they were actually designed to teach us something, not just to be a message that we remembered for later. And so there's 3 things that parables did. So in Scripture, 1/3 of what we have that Jesus said. So if you have a Bible that has red letters in it, 1/3 of those letters are in parable form. Those are parables and stories that Jesus told. So I think it's always helpful to make sure we know how to read a parable before we approach it. So parables accomplished 3 things. The first one is this. Parables always brought a big concept down to normal day life. They took a huge theological concept of who God was, and they brought it down to normal everyday life that we would understand. That's why most parables are about farming or about the temple, because it was about normal everyday life that the hearers would understand. Huge theological concept, everyday life. The next thing that they would do is parables always wanted you to learn something new about God. They kind of wanted to inspire some awe and wonder. They wanted you to hear the story and then be like, whoa, that's who God is? Like, that's what a parable wants you to react with. And if you notice, if you ever read a parable in the Gospels, you're going to see 3 responses. The first one, people are going to be excited. The second one, people are going to be confused because they haven't got it yet and they're asking lots of questions. Or the third one, people are going to be angry. And it's because of this last reason that parables always do that I think we miss in modern day reading, is parables always call the hearer to a decision right here and right now. Parables are never told for just this thing that we think of later. They're never told for that, oh, just keep this in mind one day when you need it. No. When Jesus told a parable, he was telling the hearers, you have to make a decision where you're at on this right now. And a lot of times, they got real angry on that, because parables usually do some disrupting in us. And so I'm just telling you all this because when we read it, you and I are going to be faced with a decision. And so we might need to buckle up, because as we read this parable, you and I might be challenged on where we're at on this idea of forgiveness. Does that sound good? So now you ready for a parable? Yes. Perfect. Okay. So this is the parable of the unmerciful servant. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold and repay the debt. Okay, so we got to pause here because we're not a high cash society anymore, right? Most of the cash that we have on us is digital on the form of Venmo or cards, right? We don't carry a lot of cash. So let's go back one slide. When it says Like right there, 10,000 bags of gold. I don't know if you brought your bag of gold with you today, but that's not a society that we know how that works, right? We don't naturally think of that. Here's what you need to know, what he's saying there. 10,000 bags of gold is an astronomical sum of money, okay? This is like Scrooge McDuck swimming money is what we're talking about here. Have everybody seen DuckTales? I'm revealing my age right there, okay? And so like, this is this is not money that you make in a lifetime. This is like 1,000 lifetimes of money, okay? So you have to know that as the hearers hear this, it's not like the master's like, hey, I'm gonna send you a Venmo request and you need to pay me back. No. This guy owes more money than anybody would ever owe. Like you're talking top percentage of money that the earth has type idea. So the hearers are automatically amazed about this because how does that person even owe that much money? So there's a punchline coming because as we go to the next slide, it's going to say that what they normally do is if you owe that much money, then your wife, your family is going to be sold to work off the debt. But here's the punchline that comes next. At this time, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged. I will pay back everything. No, you won't. There's no way you could pay. I mean, there's a comedic value that Jesus is telling in this story that we don't get because we don't think in bags of gold anymore. But we have to think in lots of zeros and lots of commas. And this guy's saying, I'm going to pay everything back. That's like saying the check is in the mail. I'm also revealing my age again there too, right? Because we don't do checks anymore, let's be honest. But he's trying to say, I'm going to pay you back a sum that you're not going to be able to do. But then look what happened. The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell on his knees and begged him, be patient with me, and I will pay it back. If you notice, he says almost exactly word for word what that man just told the master. But he refused. Instead, he went off and he had the man thrown in prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said. I canceled all the debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all that he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. So, servant is forgiven astronomical sum, then goes, and minutes later, he holds somebody to paying him mere pennies. Think of it this way. Lifetimes of money and thousands of bags of gold, days of money that he can't forgive. So this story invites you and I into something very similar. The parable invites us into a story where those who refuse to forgive people around us demonstrate as little gratitude for God's forgiveness of them as the unforgiving servant has shown to his peer. Which means you and I, if we forget and aren't able to forgive people around us, we are practicing the exact same way that the servant did. And let's be honest, forgiveness doesn't always come easy, does it? But what we do there is we're forgetting everything that God has forgiven us. This story kind of puts into consideration, do we live in view of God's mercy in such a way that we understand that God will always be the bigger forgiver? God will always be the bigger forgiver than we ever will. Now, we need to pause here because I know that there's a vast number of stories here in this room today. There's some that in your mind you're thinking of minor things that you're like, oh, maybe I should let that go. And then there's others that have major things that have happened to them that they're wrestling with forgiveness. All I'm saying is I'm inviting us into a story, and the truth is behind it is, does our forgiveness reflect that which God has forgiven us? Because if it hasn't, then this parable is written just for us. And I think Jeremy has done an amazing job in this series so far, because what he's reminded us of is he's reminded us of that forgiveness isn't signing up for more, that forgiveness isn't the same thing as trust, and that trust and forgiveness are two different conversations. Forgiveness isn't condoning or excusing something that has happened before. That's what I love about our mission, is that we're a people of grace and truth. That doesn't mean that we ignore, that doesn't mean we hide, that doesn't mean we forget. It means we wrestle with truth, but then we look and try to reflect God's grace, right? But I think there's some truth in what forgiveness is that you and I need to be reminded of more often than not. Forgiveness is a choice that you and I have at all times. And so I'm gonna give you kind of three thoughts on forgiveness. Some of this is a little bit of a reminder of things we've talked about, but I think it comes in a helpful place of understanding this parable. And the first one is this: forgiveness it needs to be seen as a choice. It's a choice that you and I have. It doesn't have to be a feeling. And I would even say it's actually more of a practice that we build into our life. And I remember writing this message over the last week or so. I was reminded of a season in my life, and I'll be honest, I didn't start this week, but I need to bring this back. But there was a good season in my life where I started journaling every morning, and my goal was about 15 minutes in the morning, and my goal was to journal about the day before. Because usually, I don't know about you, but you go through a day, and you have all the emotions of that day, and then you get to sleep on it, and then the next morning you can usually think back on it a little bit more sober-minded, right? Like you can kind of reflect on your conversations and what happened, all the things that that would happen. So what I would do is, in that 15 minutes journaling, one of my questions that I would ask is there any conversations that I need to readdress? Are there any people that I need to go back to and either ask for forgiveness, or do we leave something rough that I need to go back and extend? And it became a practice in me so much that actually I've kind of missed it. And I'm telling you this just so you can keep me accountable so I start doing this again. But it became so much of a practice for me that it was just kind of fun to go back to a conversation. And I didn't do it every day, but sometimes, you know how you have those conversations that you walk away from and you're like, that didn't really end well. Anybody have those? What if over the next day or two you went back and said, hey, I just want to make sure that this isn't what you heard. Or I just want to make sure that we didn't leave that in a rough spot. Could you imagine what that would do for some of your friendships when you started doing that? I miss that. But what it taught me is that forgiveness was a practice that I could begin just extending to others, and I could remember if I needed to go ask for forgiveness, I didn't forget to go do that. Because that's also a convenient thing too. Anybody ever done that? You offend somebody and then you kind of forget and you're like, oh, maybe I don't need to ask them anymore. Yeek. What would happen if you just addressed it, even before they said something to you? The next thing is this, and you've heard this a little bit, is forgiveness is letting go of revenge. Forgiveness is letting go of a debt that you're owed. I'll say it this way, because I think this helps. Forgiving is proactively forgiving them in the present, instead of passively wanting the past to change. You and I, cognitively, we understand that you can't change the past, right? We get that. You also can't control the future, right? Sorry for all those control people out there, okay? So can't happen, can't change the past, can't control the future. But what you can do is you can be very responsible with the present. And I think what forgiveness does is it's taking a proactive step in the present to deal with something that's between you and another person. Now, we can be passive about it. Anybody passive aggressive people here? No, I'm just kidding. You wouldn't even raise your hand anyways. And so, but passive aggression, right? That means something happens between you and somebody else, and then what do? You go to everybody else and deal with that situation instead of the person that you need to deal with it, right? Letting go of revenge is proactively just dealing with that person. Hey, we need to have a talk because there's something between us. And here's the thing that happens when that happens is when forgiveness is found, this next thing is very true. It removes a roadblock. Because I'll tell you this, unforgiveness blocks things. Unforgiveness closes down roads. Forgiveness opens them. Unforgiveness tears apart relationships. Forgiveness brings you closer. I had a friend that taught me this in an interesting way because I wasn't expecting it, but I had a really close friend. I moved to Beijing, spent a long time there, And a couple years in, there was this guy that him and I would meet. He was kind of a mentor to me. He was a little bit older. He knew a whole bunch more than me about stuff. And so we would meet every week for coffee. And we were close friends. So we had those moments where we were like mad at each other and we fought and we argued and all that. We were just really close friends. He was like a brother. And one day he comes to coffee and he sits down and the first thing he says is, John, and I need to ask you for forgiveness. Which was weird because I was like, we're good right now. Why? Like, we're not arguing about anything. We've had those moments. What happened? And he started talking and I was like, oh, and to be honest, this was the easiest thing for me to forgive because I had no clue what was going on. But he said, from the day that I met you, and it was kind of funny, I'll have to say this, he was apologizing for something he thought about me, but it wasn't like he thought I was like stealing or something criminal. It's just this thought that he had about me for a long time that he felt guilty on. And this is what it was. It was more insulting than anything. And he thought, the day he met me, he learned what my bachelor's degree was in, and he thought it was subpar to his degree. Because he was an engineer, and I was definitely not, okay? And so for our relationship, like for our friendship, he always thought that his education was better, so he always thought he was smarter. I never knew this because he treated me like a friend. But then one day he comes and says, I need to ask you forgiveness because I've lived with this for a long time, and I didn't even know it was there. And I was like, oh, wow. And like I said, it was the easiest thing in the world for me to forgive, but it taught me something. He had such a spiritual sensitivity about him that he wanted to make sure that nothing would come in between us as friends. And I thought that was pretty powerful because for a long time, I just thought you asked for forgiveness when you were fighting. I didn't realize that you could ask for forgiveness when something was just coming in between two people. And so that taught me, hey, maybe I just want to make sure that we're good with people, not waiting until the fight blows up, right? But forgiveness is releasing. You saw that if you were here last week and you saw that message, you saw Jeremy kind of pull up that weight, and you saw what that means when you hold this weight. And it's true. When we are living in unforgiveness, we are holding things so tight, and forgiveness means we get to release it. Can I give you a quick illustration? Because I want you to feel this a little bit physically. Is if you're holding something, can you let it go? And I just want to see both your hands. Can you lift both your hands up for a minute? So have your hands, maybe wiggle your fingers a little bit, wake yourself up a little bit. Okay, now what I want you to do is I want you to ball them up like a fist. And I want you to go real tight, like you're about to hit something. Don't hit anybody, okay? No, but, okay, now go tight, and now go a little tighter, and now go a little bit tight as you possibly can. Do you feel the blood kind of being pushed out of your hands right now? This is called white knuckling, right? Now on the count of 3, we're all going to release. You ready? 1, 2, 3. Release and move your fingers. Doesn't that feel amazing? Isn't that such a good feeling? Guess what you just experienced? You just experienced forgiveness. You ready? Go tight again. This is unforgiveness. Unforgiveness is when we're holding something against somebody. Guess what unforgiveness is? It's tiring. It's preoccupation. It's getting focused on something that's right here instead of something that's bigger. Guess what forgiveness is? It opens up pathways. Forgiveness opens, unforgiveness closes. Unforgiveness will absolutely always rob you of stuff. Forgiveness will always open up doors. And so when you and I are told a story about someone who was forgiven a huge debt and then walks away and can't forgive a small debt, it's a challenge to you and I. Where does our forgiveness come from? Does our forgiveness come when we feel like it? Or does our forgiveness come out of a love because we realize of how much we're loved, we can share that with others? One of my favorite quotes about forgiveness isn't really theological at all, but it's so practical, and it's by a guy named C.S. Lewis. You might have heard of him. And it says this: everyone thinks forgiveness is a lovely idea until he has something to forgive. Isn't that true? Forgiveness in this way is a lot like patience. Everybody thinks patience is great until you get stuck in traffic or get in a long line. Then patience goes out the window. Well, guess what? When you get offended, it's real easy to forget everything that God's done for us. It's real easy to forget the love that Jesus has for us and get fixated on that thing that we want to hold against somebody, right? God says, I will not, now I'm misquoting it. I got to go back in my notes and read it again. God says, I read this at the beginning, their sins and lawless acts I will remember no more. What God is saying there is I will no longer bring those back against you. What if that's how you and I looked at forgiveness? To where the minute you say, I'm going to choose to forgive, it's like saying, I'm going to put this down. I'm not going to try to forget it, but I'm no longer going to bring it back against you the next time we interact. That's making that choice to forgive. That's making that choice to open up a roadway and to let go of revenge. Because let's be honest, you and I have been called to love God and to love others. Jesus sums up all the commandments with those two statements. And if we want to learn what love is, we're probably going to have to learn what forgiveness is, right? Can I pray for us?